Hello and welcome to Vices and Volumes, a fortnightly podcast where I explore my collection of 19th century books, uncovering the scandalous, the ordinary and the unexpectedly human stories hidden inside their pages. My name is Avril Clinton-Forde and I'll be your host and guide. As an independent podcast, the success of this show depends entirely on you. If you're enjoying Vices and Volumes, please subscribe on Spotify, YouTube or wherever you're listening. Leave a rating or a review, share an episode with a friend or leave a comment. You can also follow along on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok at Vices and Volumes, or visit the website vicesandvolumes.com. Your engagement is what helps the podcast to grow and reach more people who love these stories as much as we do. This podcast started as a passion project, a way to share books I love and stories that fascinate me, and it's genuinely become one of my favourite things to do. I love connecting with people who share the curiosity about the past, and knowing you're out there listening is the best part of doing this. Happy New Year, everyone. It is so nice to be back. I don't know about you guys, but I had a nice break with family and friends over the Christmas. I've eaten far too much and spent far too much time reading, but it's been a good break. I'm really looking forward to the podcast this year. I have some ideas and I'm hoping things work out and I'll be able to bring you some extra interesting content and things that you'll really enjoy to listen to. But for the moment, we are diving into Dublin, August 1852, just months after the Great Famine officially ended. We'll follow a controversial British traveller through a storm-tossed arrival, a charming guided tour by an enthusiastic cab driver with spectacularly creative historic facts, and an unexpected encounter with political monuments that moved him more than he anticipated. This is a portrait of Dublin at a crucial moment, recovering from catastrophe, grappling with political change, yet somehow maintaining its capacity for humour, beauty and charm. This episode is all taken from the 1853 American edition of A Fortnight in Ireland, published in New York by G.P. Putnam & Co., just 1 year after the London original appeared, from John Murray. The speed of transatlantic publication tells its own little story. Irish-American interest in Ireland during the famine's aftermath was intense, and American publishers knew there was a hungry market for accounts of the old country. Despite being well read and 173 years old, this book is in remarkably good condition. That solid, satisfying feel of a book that's been valued and cared for across generations. To be honest, it almost feels new. Normally, I stumble across books by luck and purchasing in the hope that they have something to offer. However, this one I actually sought out. And the reason I sought out this particular book is that it appears again and again in modern scholarship on famine in Victorian Ireland. Historians, sociologists and cultural analysts refer to Head's account when examining this period. It's treated as one of those first-hand sources. Despite its biases and limitations, it manages to paint a realistic picture of Ireland in 1852. I've seen it cited so often that I needed to read it for myself, to engage with the primary source rather than just the excerpts and quotations filtered through other writers' interpretations. There's something irreplaceable about reading these accounts firsthand. You can catch the texture, the tone, the small human details that don't make it into scholarly analysis, but that tell you what it actually felt like to be in Dublin that August. Head's Fortnight in Ireland covers far more than Dublin. Later chapters examine his journey across the beautiful but devastated countryside, the brutal evictions and grinding poverty of rural Ireland, topics I'll explore in future episodes. But I wanted to start with the Dublin chapter because I was born and raised in the Dublin suburbs. My family are all from Dublin, and the city was essentially my backyard. Shopping trips, museum visits, running errands with my parents, days out in town. Dublin was where we went when we wanted a proper outing. But it is also a city of extraordinary beauty. Georgian and Victorian buildings of architectural brilliance, a city bursting with culture and personality. Dublin is small and low-lying, a walkable city that you can traverse from Trinity College to Stephen's Green, from Dublin Castle to the National Concert Hall, from the Custom House to the forecourts without ever feeling overwhelmed by its scale. It's famous for its rows of Victorian and Georgian buildings and those Georgian doors, magnificent painted entrances with fan lights and brass fixtures that turn entire streets into architectural galleries. This beauty was there in 1852 and remarkably, it's still there today, a testament to the city's resilience through a tumultuous history. The man who observed all this beauty on that stormy August evening in 1852 was Sir Francis Bond Head. Not just any traveller, but a man of considerable credentials and even more considerable controversy. Born in 1793, he'd been commissioned to the Royal Engineers in 1811, serving throughout the Mediterranean and fighting at Waterloo in 1815. After leaving the military in 1825, he ventured to South America to manage mining operations in Argentina, where his extraordinary horseback journeys across the Pampas and Andes earned him the nickname Galloping Head. His 1826 book, Rough Notes Taken During Some Rapid Journeys Across the Pampas and Among the Andes, became a bestseller, establishing him as a vivid travel writer. But it was his colonial career that made him infamous. In 1835, at just 42 years of age, despite having virtually no administrative experience, Head was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. His tenure was a disaster. Rather than mediating between reformers demanding responsible government and the conservative family compact oligarchy, he threw his support entirely behind the Conservatives. When reformers led by William Lyon Mackenzie rebelled in December 1837, Head personally organised the militia response and suppressed the uprising within days. However, his inflexible governance had contributed directly to the crisis. He was recalled to England in 1838 and simultaneously created a baronet. Many viewed the knighthood as a consolation prize for a humiliating failure. By 1852, Head was a best-selling author, a knight, and a former governor with access to the highest levels of society. His military engineering background gave him access to professional networks throughout the empire. But he was also a cautionary tale in colonial mismanagement. This combination makes his observations of post-famine Ireland particularly interesting. He'd seen firsthand how government inflexibility could turn political grievance into armed rebellion. Whether that experience gave him any humility or insight, we are about to discover. Having read his book, I believe Head himself made genuine efforts to observe fairly, to engage with the Irish people as individuals rather than abstractions, and to capture both the beauty and character of a country that was in crisis. He viewed Ireland through a very British lens, and how could he not? He's British himself. But within those limitations, there is a real observation and unexpected sympathy. He saw the Irish poor not as problems to be solved, but as human beings surviving with dignity and humour. For this Dublin chapter in particular, that combination of keen observation and genuine warmth creates a portrait of a city that, regardless of all circumstances, refused to surrender its character. The date was August the 11th, 1852, and Sir Francis Bond Head was not having a pleasant journey. The London Express train had deposited him at Holyhead at 1840 in the evening, where a large black steamer awaited to ferry passengers across the Irish Sea to Dublin. It was, as Head observed, blowing half a gale of wind, raining, and at intervals thundering rather loudly. The weather was what Head diplomatically called pitiless. And as he watched it from his railway carriage, he observed the comedy of suffering humanity. Passengers in mackintoshes and cloaks struggling with umbrellas that he noted were, from being convex suddenly to become concave in the violent wind. The crossing itself was predictably wretched. Head described fixing a berth in the gentleman's cabin. The circular line of sofa divided into berths of beds about 6 feet each, where not only engaged, but where most of the occupants, with a pillow under their heads, were already reclining them at full length, anxious to be as close to fresh air as possible. By the time they arrived in Dublin Bay, it was night. Head recalled that arising or descending from our respective lairs, we staggered on deck, from whence all that I could see of Ireland consisted of a couple of very large red eyes and one white one glaring as beacons through the darkness and rain. This was his first glimpse of Ireland, 3 lighthouse beacons in storm and darkness. It's a stark contrast to how we arrive in Dublin today. The pigeon house chimneys lit up, the Aviva Stadium glowing in the distance, and all of the lights of Dublin sparkling into the Dublin mountains. The chaos at the pier that followed was considerable, and Head's description captures the confusion. The baggage of all passengers was handed up through a hatchway from the very bottom of the hold, and almost as fast as it appeared, it was carried away. I knew not where, by a set of porters of whom everybody appeared desirous to engage, and who, nevertheless, without seeking for employers, rushed to the baggage, well knowing that, possession being 9 points of their law, and the 10th portion in the shape of the owner, would be sure to find them. Head felt much too frail to engage in a contest between boisterous competitors. but eventually spotted his portmanteau and enlisted the help of getting it to the awaiting train. A short journey later, about 15 minutes, he had arrived. Here, the peculiarities of Dublin transport presented themselves immediately. Head requested a carriage to take him to Morrison's hotel, and to my vast surprise, instead of moving forward as expected, the vehicle, like a crab, started off sideways. The famous Irish jaunting car with passengers sitting back to back facing outward had made its entrance. These jaunting cars are always mentioned by visitors and other writers. They were surprising because instead of facing forwards or backwards in the carriage, you were placed facing out to the side, back to back in the centre of the car. You can imagine that this would have felt rather precarious and a little bit uncomfortable, causing you to twist towards the direction of travel. Following his sideways journey, Head arrived at Morrison's Hotel at exactly 10 minutes after midnight. Morrison's Hotel at the time was one of Dublin's most fashionable establishments, located at the corner of Dawson Street and Nassau Street. It had been founded by Arthur Morrison, who served as Lord Mayor of Dublin from 1835 to 1836. According to contemporary accounts, the hotel drew distinguished guests. Charles Dickens had stayed there during his Dublin visits in the 1850s, and Charles Stuart Parnell would later be arrested there in 1881. The hotel stood almost opposite Trinity College Provost's Garden, the heart of Georgian Dublin. Today, it's a Costa Coffee. But Head saw none of this grandeur. He arrived in total darkness, and his first request to the waiter was telling. "Would your honour like to take anything?" said the voice of a waiter almost before I was within the threshold. "Yes," I replied, "a bedroom candle." With only this single candle for light, Head was conducted to a clean, well-furnished room where I managed to unpack what was requisite, and in due time, under darkness, I found myself between the linen sheets of a comfortable bed. This moment, so easily passed over, deserves a little pause. We're so accustomed to electric light that we forget what travelling meant in 1852. No ambient lighting on the streets of Dublin. Dublin was the second largest city in the British Isles, with approximately 260,000 residents, and saw absolutely nothing of it. No grand architecture, no bustling street, no sense of place, just darkness, a single candle, and a clean bed. His philosophical reflection captures the peculiar situation. Well, I said to myself, it's certainly rather a clever feat to have gotten into a four-poster bed in Dublin without having bothered oneself with the old-fashioned, controversial comparison between the beauty of its bay and that of Naples. Here I am, snug in the heart of a great country in which I have not even seen an extremity. In the morning, which was beautifully fine, after a good breakfast, I mounted a horse, which I thought would be the most daring, independent, and least fatiguing mode of looking about me. The choice reveals both the background and his intentions. As a former Royal Engineer of the legendary Galloping Head, who'd ridden thousands of miles across Pampas, Head was most comfortable observing from horseback. More importantly, it gave him height, mobility, and the ability to form his own impressions without a formal guide or official minder shaping his perspective. Funny enough, it never occurred to me either that you could hire a horse the same way we hire a Dublin bike with an app these days. The selection of his companion, however, was not entirely in his control. He recalled, "I was slowly riding, I knew not where, or indeed did I care, when I heard behind me the pattering of a pair of naked human feet. 'Will your honour give me a job?' said a nice-looking lad with a small piece of shirt sticking out a slight hole in his trousers behind." The boy's persistence and the rapid accumulation of additional applicants forced Head to make a decision. He hired the first boy, instructing him, "Now keep close to this stirrup, and if anyone else comes after me, tell him at once I am engaged to you." The boy's response, "I will, your honour," delivered with a very decisive nod, was reassuring. This scene reveals the Dublin that existed in August 1852. Just months after the official end of the Great Famine, Ireland had lost approximately 25% of its population between 1845 and 1852 through death and immigration. Dublin, while less affected than rural areas, still bore visible scars. Head's observation of the persistent beggars was not unique to him. At one point he noted, "I hope your honour will give me a copper," said the feeble voice of a poor old woman who, availing herself of the stoppage, had hobbled up to me. "I'm wake with the hunger," she added. The phrase would have resonated, particularly in her in 1852. She was weak with hunger. It was a defining phrase of the famine years. But Head's attention was captured less by the suffering than by Dublin's physical environment. His engineer's eye assessed the city systematically. He observed that Dublin appeared to be a plain, useful brick city with magnificent public buildings and here and there across its river fine bridges of iron and stone. The randomness of architecture struck him. About the altitude of the houses, there exists no particular rule. Indeed, like Falstaff Squad, they have evidently been readily enlisted at any height. Neither has there been any regulation about their colour, for they are very red, reddish, strawberry-coloured and cream-coloured. Most remarkably, Head was impressed by Dublin's air quality. His observation is worth quoting at length. But what I most admired in the city of Dublin are its magnificent lungs. In a 4-mile heat, it would inevitably beat any metropolis on the surface of the globe. For instance, one of its lungs has an area no less than 17 acres, while the other is composed of large, healthy squares from 12 to 10, 8 and 6 acres each. What a fine windpipe, too, is the Liffey. There may be want of trade or want of unanimity, a want of brotherly love between this creed and that. There may even be a want of potatoes, but there is no want in Dublin, and there never can be, of an abundant supply of good, wholesome, pure air. It's hardly surprising that an Englishman would comment on this, since in 1852, air pollution in British industrial cities had reached catastrophic levels. According to research by economic historians W. Walker Hanlon and others, coal emissions in Victoria, Britain were up to 50 times higher than they would be after the Clean Air Acts of the mid-20th century. Coal intensity was highest in the Midlands, North England and South Wales. London's smogs had become legendary. Dickens made them a defining feature of his novels, and Henrik Ibsen, 1865 play, Brand, lamented that Britain's suffocating coal dust is slowly descending over the countryside, soiling all that is green. Research published in the Ecological Economics had shown that as early as 1850s, higher coal intensity was directly associated with higher death rates from respiratory diseases, particularly among children and the elderly. Dublin, by contrast, had far less heavy industry. It was primarily a port city and an administrative capital rather than an industrial centre. The Phoenix Park alone, which Head would visit later, comprised of 1,752 acres of open parkland. Stephen's Green, Merrion Square and other Georgian squares provided what Head called the city's lungs. His enthusiasm was not misplaced. Dublin genuinely did have exceptional air quality compared to British industrial cities, and this still prevails today, with Dublin ranking in the top 5 cities for cleanest air in global reports. After his morning ride, Head had business to transact. He mentioned stopping at the Ordnance Office to inquire for the address of the commanding engineer. This detail is significant. Head, as a former captain of the Royal Engineers who served from 1811 to 1825, would naturally call upon his professional colleagues. The Board of Ordnance was responsible for military fortifications, barracks and engineering works throughout the British Empire. A grey-headed man at the office provided an address that turned out to be incorrect. It was 40 Lower Mount Street instead of 40 Upper Mount Street. The boy guide's defence was characteristic. "Your Honour, the boy said it was in the Lower Street, and sure I thought he'd know best." Having completed his business, Head dismissed the barefoot guide and hired a proper jaunting cab. There, he noted, no less than 15,000 of them in Dublin, and the competition among the drivers was fierce, and in this case amusing. Head recorded their competing pitches. "Here's a car, Your Honour. My car's a new one," says another, running hurriedly up. "I've an elegant horse," exclaims a third. "Yes, but mine don't come down on his knees, Your Honour," says a fourth. "Look at my nice dry cushions, Your Honour," says a fifth. "Dry enough," observes a sixth, very gravely, adding with a cunning leer, "but mine have got no bugs in them, Your Honour." Head selected one that had not offered himself at all, and the gratitude of the successful driver was immediate and effusive. The man, described as about 50 years of age, with a round, unmeaning face and such very short lips that his white teeth, there were all 14 of them, were always uncovered. He proceeded to provide Head with a tour of Dublin, accompanied by the most wonderfully creative historical commentary imaginable. The centrepiece of his education was Nelson's Pillar, the monument that stood in the middle of Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street, a massive Doric column erected between 1808 and 1809. According to records held at the National Library of Ireland, it rose 134 feet high, 121 feet of granite column topped with a 13-foot statue of Admiral Horatio Nelson, carved by Cork sculptor Thomas Kirk. Inside, 168 spiral stairs led to a viewing platform offering panoramic views of Dublin. The monument commemorated Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where he had defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets. Head's cab driver, however, had his own interpretation. Pulling up suddenly and pointing with his whip, he exclaimed loudly enough to attract attention, "There's our Nelson with one of his arms over the shoulder, his left arm stretched out and a sword in it. He's looking down on the ships and he's saying, 'He was a seaman.'" When Head inquired, "What, a sailor?" the driver was evidently pleased at the opportunity of instructing me and replied, "Your Honour, he was one of the finest admirals the government ever had." The enthusiasm built. "A good man to fight?" I asked. "Your Honour," he replied, greatly excited, "he was one of the greatest. He bet the whole world before him. Nelson ruled the men," he exclaimed as he waved his whip with exultation and pride. The manner of Nelson's death received equally passionate treatment. "Your Honour," he replied, "he was shot by a Frenchman. He aimed at the star like this, Your Honour," touching with the butt of his whip a large round iron ticket on his own breast, which was inscribed with a crown, and beneath that the word driver, and under all the number says 297. "And Nelson was shot through the heart." After contemplating the statue, he concluded, "It's the finest monument in all of Dublin. There's nothing like it." The irony of this enthusiastic endorsement would not have been lost on Head. Nelson's pillar was, in 1852, already controversial. It stood as a monument to British naval power in the heart of Ireland's capital. Daniel O'Connell's monument would later be erected further down the street, followed by monuments to William Smith O'Brien and Charles Stewart Parnell, each one, as historian Yvonne Whelan describes, representing a challenge in stone to British authority. The pillar survived until March 1966, when it was destroyed by an IRA bomb during the celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Easter Rising. Today, the spire of Dublin rises from the spot where Nelson once stood. But what makes Head's account so delightful is not the historical irony, it's the sheer warmth of the cab driver's presentation. His facts were wildly inaccurate. Nelson lost his right arm, not his left. He was killed at Trafalgar, not shot by a Frenchman, aiming specifically at his star. But his enthusiasm was genuine and his pride in our Nelson was unfeigned. The driver's other historical observations were equally creative. Pointing to an equestrian statue, he announced, "There's William the Conqueror." The statue was actually of William III, but the driver was undeterred, and his explanation of Dublin's name was equally inventive. "Your Honour, it was once not only all grain, but the old records, it was called College Green, near Dublin. Dublin, Your Honour, took its name from a double inn, two houses stuck into one. From then, Dublin took its title." Throughout these cheerful fabrications, Head maintained his composure and his sense of humour. The driver's charm lay not in his accuracy, but in his delivery and the warmth, the pride, the genuine desire to share his city with a visitor. It was Irish hospitality operating at full capacity, though, as Head might have observed, with considerably more wit than wisdom. Among all the sights that Head's enthusiastic cab driver showed him, one struck him with unexpected force. He described riding into Merrion Square, a large square of about a dozen acres of grass, of such a lovely emerald hue that I was really almost startled at beholding it. According to Georgian Dublin historical records, Merrion Square was developed in the 1760s and 1770s as one of Dublin's most prestigious addresses. With elegant Georgian townhouses surrounding the central park, Head asked his guide to show him the house formerly occupied by the great liberator, and what he found moved him in a way that Nelson's pillar had not. I was wondering who might be the successful candidate for so renowned a habitation when, on pulling up my horse before it, I was astonished to see not only O'Connell on a brass plate, but in the window a large placard which looked as if it had been issued by him instead, however, of advertising a public meeting on College Green. I read the melancholy words, "To be sold or let." Head's response is worth quoting in full. This was his mansion, his name, his own printed order of "Ring the Bell," the brass handle by which, on leaving the house, had always closed its door behind him, where the stone steps so often trod by his feet and yet had lost their magic value. And the bricks and stone and brass of the agitator are at this very moment in Dublin vainly petitioning to every passing stranger to be sold or let. To understand why this scene affected Head so deeply, we need to know who Daniel O'Connell was, and why even a conservative British former colonial governor would find his empty house poignant. Daniel O'Connell was born on August 6, 1775 in County Kerry. According to his biographer Daniel Green, he was raised among the Catholic peasantry and learned Irish as his first language, giving him an intimate understanding of the lives of the ordinary Irish Catholics. Educated in France during the revolutionary period, he witnessed firsthand the violence of the terror, which shaped his lifelong commitment to achieving political change through peaceful means rather than force. He qualified as a barrister and built a hugely successful legal practice in Dublin, using the courts as a nationalist forum. O'Connell's great achievement came in 1829. Parliamentary records show that although Catholics had legally been banned from serving as members of Parliament since the penal laws, O'Connell stood for election in County Clare in 1828 and won overwhelmingly. The crisis this created, a Catholic elected but unable to take a seat, forced the British government's hand. Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, fearing a civil war, pushed through the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, and O'Connell became the first Catholic to sit in Parliament in modern British history, earning him the title the Liberator. But O'Connell's ambitions went beyond Catholic rights. His ultimate goal was repeal of the Act of the Union 1800, which had abolished the Irish Parliament and incorporated Ireland into the United Kingdom. Through the 1840s, he organised massive public meetings, the famous monster meetings that attracted hundreds of thousands of supporters. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, an estimated 750,000 people attended the meeting at the Hill of Tara. The government arrested O'Connell for seditious conspiracy in 1843, though released after 3 months when his conviction was overturned on appeal. His health never recovered. The Great Famine, which began in 1845, devastated both Ireland and O'Connell's political movement. His final appearance in the House of Commons came in February 1847 when, as the Times reported, he stood oppressed with grief and made desperate pleas. Ireland is in your hands, in your power. If you do not save her, she cannot save herself. I solemnly call on you to recollect that I predict with the sincerest conviction that 1/4 of her population will perish unless you come to her relief. O'Connell died on May 15, 1847, in Genoa, Italy, while travelling to Rome. He was 71 years old. His body was returned to Ireland and buried at Glasnevin Cemetery in August 1847. 5 years later, when Head arrived in Dublin, O'Connell's house on Merrion Square stood empty, his name still on the brass plate, awaiting a buyer or tenant. But why would this move a conservative British officer like Head? The answer lies in what O'Connell represented beyond his Irish nationalism. As Head himself observed later in his account, and so, while people are declaring that between the Saxon and the Celt there exists an animosity that is implacable, the finest monument in Dublin, erected by public subscription at the cost of £7,000, commemorates the name of an Englishman, while on the other side of the Channel, the finest monument in London, heap eternal honour on the name of an Irishman. What a national bond of union are those two simple facts. Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, was Irish-born, and his monument stood as a testament to Ireland's contribution to British military glory. The relationship between Britain and Ireland was more complex than simple antagonism, and O'Connell's empty house, with its pathetic to be sold or let sign, represented not just the death of one man, but the failure of a peaceful dream of reconciliation. Head's visit concluded with a call on the Lord Lieutenant at the Vice-Regal Lodge in the Phoenix Park. The lodge had been built in 1751 by Nathaniel Clements and purchased by the government in 1782 as the residence for the Lord Lieutenant, the monarch's representative in Ireland. According to Bodleian Library records, in August 1852, the Lord Lieutenant was George Villiers, 4th Earl of Clarendon, who held the position since 1847. Clarendon's tenure coincided with the worst years of the famine, and his reports on the scale of the crisis were regularly discounted by a British government that deferred to Treasury official Sir Charles Trevelyan's insistence on minimal intervention. Clarendon would leave office later in 1852, moving to become Foreign Secretary in 1853. Head described the Vice-Regal Lodge and its surroundings with its characteristic eye for detail. On entering the mansion, with, at a glance, appeared admirably well regulated and appointed, I remained for a short time by myself in the principal waiting room. Outside the window was an extensive, beautiful, closely mown lawn, flat as a bowling green and ornamented with flowers in beds of various shapes and sizes. And as striking contrast to their brilliant colours, there stood here and there slight, elegant, dark green cypresses, the whole being surrounded by a broad, royal-looking walk on which I observed a pacing blue policeman, bound by a bright, buff-coloured stone balustrade. The contrast between this serene, elegant setting of the chaos of the famine-ravaged country, just miles away, was a little stark. Head makes no comment on the politics of the situation. He was, after all, a guest. But his account captures the peculiar position of British authority in Ireland, magnificent, well-guarded, surrounded by beauty, yet fundamentally isolated from the suffering beyond its walls. As the Dublin leg of Head's trip came to a close, he found himself on a Sunday evening around 5 o'clock, seated in a large, roomy, comfortable armchair at an open window of the Hibernian United Service Club on the north side of St. Stephen's Green. From this vantage point, he observed carloads of happy people going and returning from Donnybrook Fair. What struck him most was the democratic nature of this exodus. Everyone, regardless of class, was heading to the fair together, packed into different jaunting cars regardless of who they were or what they represented. He described it. In one were boys, in another girls, in another boys and girls, in every possible joyous variety of arrangement. There were old men, old women, gaudy soldiers, fleshy-looking women, children of every age, all grinning, all going or coming from Donnybrook Fair. Donnybrook Fair, established by the Royal Charter from King John in 1204, had by 1852 become something rather different from its original purpose as a trade fair for horses and cattle. According to the contemporary accounts, it had evolved into a massive public spectacle, held annually for 15 days, starting August 26, drawing crowds estimated of 50,000 to 75,000 people. The fair had gained an international reputation, and not an entirely wholesome one. By the 19th century, as the Parliamentary Gazetteer delicately put it in 1845, it was held professedly for the sale of horses and black cattle, but really for vulgar dissipation. The sounds of drums, bells, toy trumpets, fiddles and bagpipes filled the air. There were food stalls selling everything from Dublin Bay, herrings to pig's feet, carnival amusements, dancing, and notoriously a great deal of drinking and fighting. Shillelaghs featured prominently, which is a type of walking stick often used for fighting. And the fair's reputation for chaos was so widespread that by 1852 the term Donnybrook had entered English slang as a word to mean a riotous brawl or scene of disorder. Yet Head, watching the steady stream of jaunting cars carrying Dubliners of every description towards Donnybrook, saw something more than mere disorder. He saw joy, community, and a city determined to enjoy itself despite its recent hardships. The fair would be suppressed just 3 years later in 1855, when Dublin Corporation finally purchased the licence for £3,000 in response to mounting concerns about public order. Today, the site of the fair, about 1.5 miles from Dublin city centre, is home to Beckett of Rangers Rugby Club, in what is now the beautiful suburb of Donnybrook, Dublin-Forde. But in August 1852, it was Dublin's great democratic carnival, where scarlet dragoons in glittering brass helmets shared cars with a fat gentleman with a large stomach and a man sitting as happy as a grig without a hat, all drawn by the irresistible pull of music, mayhem and communal celebration. Sir Francis Bond Head left Dublin after only a few days, but his account captures something essential about the city in a moment of transition. The famine had just ended, O'Connell was 5 years dead, British authority, represented by the Vice-Regal Lodge and Nelson's Pillar, seemed secure, but it was already being challenged by new monuments and new movements. And through it all, the Irish people, the barefoot boy guide, the enthusiastic cab driver and the persistent beggars maintained a capacity for wit, warmth and charm that even a conservative British engineer could not help but appreciate. What's wonderful about Head's account is not its political analysis. Head was no radical, but its humanity. He arrived in darkness with a single candle. He left in daylight, having been charmed by misinformation, moved by an empty house, and thoroughly entertained by a city that, despite everything, refused to lose its capacity for humour and hospitality. The cab driver's enthusiasm for our Nelson was perhaps more accurate than he knew. Monuments to British heroes did stand in Dublin, just as monuments to Irish heroes stood in London, and the tragedy was that O'Connell's vision of peaceful reconciliation between the two nations, a vision that might have allowed both peoples to claim both sets of heroes, had ended with the death and failure of the British government to prevent the famine's devastation. Head's later chapters on rural Ireland, which I'll explore in future episodes, show him grappling with far more difficult subjects than Dublin's charm. He witnessed evictions, contemplated the landlord-tenant crisis from both perspectives, and tried to make sense of a catastrophe that had killed or displaced millions. His British lens never fully disappears, but his efforts to observe fairly, to engage with Irish people as individuals rather than abstractions, and to capture the beauty and character of a country in profound crisis remain admirable. Reading A Fortnight in Ireland 173 years later, what emerges is not perfect or unbiased account, but something perhaps more valuable. An honest record of one man's genuine attempt to understand a place and people that didn't fit neatly into expectations. The fact that he was so often charmed, confused, and moved by what he found speaks well of both his openness as an observer and of Ireland's resilience as a nation. Head wasn't writing political treasts, he was writing about arriving at a hotel in darkness, being pursued by job seekers, and learning that Dublin's name came from two houses stuck into one. Sometimes the small human details tell us more than the grand political narratives, and sometimes the greatest charm lies not in getting the facts right, but in delivering them with such enthusiasm, warmth, and absolute conviction that the accuracy seems beside the point. Until next time, may your own arrivals be better lit than Head's, and may your guide be as enthusiastic as his cab driver, if perhaps slightly better informed. This has been Vices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening. Creating this podcast is a genuine joy for me, and knowing that you're out there listening and engaging with these stories makes it all worthwhile. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Vices and Volumes on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen, and consider leaving a rating or a review. It truly helps. You can also follow along on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Vices and Volumes, or visit vicesandvolumes.com for more information. And please reach out and let me know what you think. I love hearing from you. Thank you for being part of this journey.